I'm reading the book Becoming Supernatural by Dr. Joe Dispenza, and I'm just on the first bit of the first chapter after the intro. And when I read the book, I realize that so much of what I've been talking about is true. And then he's sort of written a book with more of the science about it. He was describing the process of fight or flight, or being in stress when cortisol is released, and how it does a bunch of things, but one of the things is it puts more energy to the hindbrain, and there's less creative thinking, and it's more like to get oneself out of there. And I might have talked about this before, but I feel like a person in a high energy state of so-called mania can be there for a certain amount of time, but then, and it's a high energy creative state, but eventually one realizes that one can't maintain that high energy state in an environment of very low energy and consciousness. So if one stays in that environment too long, the wonderful creativity of mania that ripples outwards and does create a lot of things, eventually it can't sustain itself. The brain operating like this in an environment like this. It can for a while, which does raise the vibration of the environment quite substantially, at least around that being who is in that state. And as the distance, supposed distance, increases, the energy level decreases. So it's like a bump in the field. And then eventually one's energy is lowered down to that of the environment. And when that happens, the brain goes into fight or flight because it realizes it needs to get out of that energy level in order to go back into that higher brain state. So if one got oneself to a higher energy level in the environment, that would be congruent with the energy of the brain, and one wouldn't necessarily go into fight or flight. I'm not sure, but it seems to be part of what happens. But most of us get captured and we never get the chance to go into a higher energy environment. We get transferred to a lower energy environment and get pumped full of low energy chemicals to lower the energy of the brain, to keep it low, in that low state, to be able to function in that. But it doesn't work. I just came across an interesting part of the book, according to what I talk about with myself. And it says something about how when we notice a significant change inside of us, the brain pays attention to who or what is happening outside of us that caused that change and records it to create a memory. Now, this is really interesting to me because our conditioning is memory. And if one is in a creative state, creative space, creative energy, it's kind of a non-self state. It's a state that isn't dominated by memory in the way that we know it. So then if somebody comes along that knows us and sort of interrupts that process, and say that person is part of our conditioning and that we know that they are part of what created us to be who we were as a non-creative entity. That person is known in memory, and that person is seen to cause the change in our internal state. Hence, sometimes we react in a moody way to protect that creative state. So say for example, one is in a really creative state for a long period of time. That might be called mania by others later on. And then family and friends and people that one knows or think they know that person who went into creativity come along and are part of the apprehension process to apprehend that person at some point and put them in the reconditioning process of the mental health system. All those people become imprinted in that one who went into the creative state's brain as part of the apprehension process, and that's traumatic. So to reintegrate that being into the family system is naturally going to create a being who appears to have this mood disorder, because those who supposedly love that person or being were part of that which was the process of reconditioning. So naturally, the brain is still going to go into that creative state at certain times. And then when one interacts with others who have now been imprinted as part of the apprehension system, apprehending one and getting one reconditioned in the mental health system, one is going to be moody with those people naturally, or appear as moody, because it activates fight or flight. Because one was in fight or flight, and those people were a part of apprehension sometimes. And if they weren't, they're a part of detention, of detaining and maintaining that individual as mentally ill. And even if that person who was labeled with a mental illness isn't consciously aware of this, they are subconsciously aware of it. So they continue to manifest as apparently mentally ill, which isn't true. But it is relatively true in the system that they are put into. So if one doesn't have that memory of apprehension subconsciously triggered by continuing to interact with those beings, one might have a chance to go back into a sustained creative state, perhaps. But it's the up and down that is the problem. It's the brain going into creativity and being interrupted by conditioning, and then that jump in level of consciousness creates an epiphenomenon of a very strong I, a very strong ego protection. So, and then again, every time that happens, the brain is going to take a snapshot of what caused that big change in state. So if I'm a hypercreative, for example, and somebody knocks on my door and they're like, rah, 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 and then I go, blah, I was here, and then I went here, and I take a picture of what caused that. So now any interaction with that being is going to be stressed and strained, because it was, my brain knows that I was here. That person that knocks on the door doesn't know that. My brain does. And then now I'm here, and I'm maybe consciously or subjectively, I don't even know why. But the brain knows. So that creates more fight or flight, building up of stress. And then eventually, one gets to a point where one's in crisis and is kicking and screaming in their supposed home environment, and then they're thrown back in the process of reconditioning again. So it's a no-win scenario. Getting out of that environment would be helpful for a chance at opening up possibilities. And when one's brain can get settled into possibility, then that conditioning won't necessarily do that per se. I don't think. I still haven't got to the point of testing that out. That's sort of the next 10 months is getting to this place where I can see what the energy does when the doer is absent, and taking that energy somewhere else where it won't be misinterpreted by the conditioning around oneself that envelops oneself and can only lead to reconditioning the entity that seems to have access to that energy at some points. Because staying in that energy is bowing down to survival and poverty consciousness. So if one is doing that, that's a gesture, an action of the belief in limitation. And, the opposite of that, or something that can manifest when one doesn't believe in limitation, is wandering in mania through talking to strangers and synchronicity, and that doesn't work either. Because that energy gets wasted still in conditioned structures and misinterpretation. And that can get misconstrued too, because in that process, the brain might record memories of doing this process of just going off and wandering and spending money and everything's fine and wonderful, will create a place where the brain sees, I could just do that again. Because it felt so good. It created this state change that's so high. So I just want to go off and be randomly whatever. So that isn't necessarily correct either. So what I'm experimenting with, don't know if it's correct, is consciously see, intelligently see, one needs to change one's environment to peace and nature for a while, of nothing, not doing anything with the energy, not going into the field of doing with the energy. Because anything that is done through the field of doing needs to be undone, and it will be undone as quickly as it was done. So to do nothing and leave nothing undone, which is a quote of sorts. And going into a more peaceful environment and doing nothing, there's not other people around saying you should be doing something. So a lot of people who get this energy, they end up doing not much of anything during life, watching TV, but then they have other people sit around them in their life judging them, thinking, well, you should be doing something, you should be functioning, you should be working, you should be doing this. And that sort of creates a field where the person sits and does nothing but watch TV. And if one is in an environment where one can do nothing and not be judged by it, do nothing and be one with nature. Nature really loves it when humans are one with them. Nature doesn't... Whoa. Butterfly. The butterfly confirms this. Nature doesn't judge and say, you should be out doing some kind of human thing. Go work. Go do something that is going to destroy nature. No, when we sit with nature, it says, just do nothing with me. And as we sit with nature, I came across a book, something about the biophilia effect. I was at a spiritual bookstore and I came across a lot of books. I don't think I need to read these books. I've already talked about most of the stuff in these books. Maybe reading it is confirming it with myself and not trying to prove it to others, of which there are none. And yeah, so nature needs more humans doing nothing with nature, being one with nature. And look at the little spider. Where is he? There he is. You'll be happier on the table, little spider. No, apparently he's happier on my hand. So when we do nothing with nature, we create a battery, a cycle of energy with the whole universe, as opposed to fragmenting our energy into human constructs, which are destroying the world. Again, I've already really talked about most of this stuff. I don't know why I'm talking about it again, but there are a few books out there for sure that I've read after I've talked to myself for so long that are saying exactly what I'm saying. That sounds a little bit too strong, but what's not happening is it's not being offered to people who go into these states. So even this book, Becoming Supernatural, is like, well, you're a normal human being. You're caught in habit and routine and boringness, and I'll tell you how to become supernatural. And there's so many people out there who are non-volitionally becoming supernatural and being thrown into the psychiatric system and not being nurtured and cared for until they settle into the supernatural state. There's nothing we have to do to get into that. I think it'd be more powerful to support those who are going into that naturally, have the people who are doers create structures for non-doing to settle in, for the quantum brain to settle in, to create quantum communities where people who get radically disconnected from human conditioning and are rendered non-functional to non-function and be cared for, supremely cared for, not fed crap and fed toxic stuff. If those people were facilitated to settle into the quantum, it would change the whole energy, and other people would be able to spontaneously do that as well without doing anything. But that sounds a little bit like communism, like, oh, change the environment and then everything will be... I don't know anything about that, but I don't know what the answer is. There is no answer. The answer might be to be in dialogue with others. But right now I'm in dialogue mostly with myself, though. One of the dialogues could be to be in dialogue with those who are doing these amazing scientific things like the Heart Math Institute, Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dr. Joe Dispenza, the Flow Genome Project, and tell them, help us. Put some of your energy towards people who have already checked out of the conditioning, who have been checked out of it by the universe, by experience, by trauma, by they're not making that connection. They're trying to help the doers. They're not nurturing the non-doers. The doers are calling the non-doers non-functional and not contributing and not this and not that. And then there's all these systems in place to keep us suppressed in doership. And we don't need to do anything. We magnetize all these systems of care around us when, if that amount of money that is put into us through systems of care like psychiatry and all these things was put into peaceful, beautiful space to allow something to flower, something else would happen. A space of unconditional love and caring for the base needs of the human body. But we're magnetizing the wrong structure, and we buy into the belief system that is a billion dollar industry. the book also says when the fight or flight nervous system turns on and stays on, it utilizes energy to neutralize the threat of the outer environment. So if one isn't in a suitable environment, one is perceiving stress from the outer environment, one's body is then and being is using energy to neutralize the threat of the outer environment. In that state, one can't go into the highly creative energy of the brain because one is wasting energy. And that's something that I've been inquiring into lately, is perceiving things that are energy wasters, and instead of trying to create with energy, not instead of, but having an experimental period of time where one isn't wasting energy in certain conflicts, and one is getting one's body to more suitable environments, like a nice park, where there is no conflict with the outer environment. The body can feel at ease and not waste energy. And then this can be recharging for the period of time that one was in an environment where the body was wasting energy, because that environment is discordant with the possibility of the internal state, or one is protecting that seed of light that is within oneself and knows that one can't plant the seed in that environment. And it's not like one chooses to do that or not. At some point, it seems that the seed gets planted and one goes into higher energy states of mind, and the flower attempts to flower anyway. And this is the cycle of so-called bipolar. It's one can't stop that seed from being planted. It will again be planted at some point. There are things one can do with supposed free will. Free will is only there because we're not flowering. So what one is saying is use one's remaining free will to get to a place where one can plant the seed and allow it to flower into something beyond this thing of free will and choice. Choosing something else, in a way, implies stress. In the book, it also says that elevated emotions release thousands of chemicals to help repair the body. And now think about this. Think about how elevated one gets in the state of so-called mania. If elevated states and emotions release chemicals to help repair the body, one could see that state as a state of repair, or releasing ripples to repair the body and repair and heal and repair some of the trauma and undo that. And in that process of all those chemicals being released to repair and heal the body, there is a congruent state subjectively and manifestly of elevatedness that goes with the release of those biochemicals that are healing. And at the same time, it produces that state of being very elevated, and the gestures and behaviors that go along with that, and the values and the traits. And at the same time, one gets a blueprint of that elevated state of how one would be if one was fully repaired. So it creates this heightened state which creates ripples of healing. And at the same time, that is the way one would be if one was healed. And it's it's a space and it's a state beyond time. It's a quantum state, and it's a state of possibility, and one goes into the state of highest possibility in manifest behavioral subjective level to create those ripples of healing into the field of time and space that one can step into, because one now has that blueprint. Hence, people go into that state again, which is a healing state again. So one isn't going to stop going into those elevated states until one is healed. And even though the elevated states are nice, they're temporary, so they're not necessarily that one is healed, but it shows the possibility of being healed. And in that state, one feels like, oh, it's going to last forever. I'm healed. I'm perfect. Everything's perfect. But one falls out of it. And one might think, well, that sucks. That's not fair. Why can't I just stay there? Well, when we fall back into the field of time and space unfolding in a linear, logical manner, we then are reacquainted with the sense of free will. So it is of our own apparent free will in the Newtonian world of linearity that we can move to create a life unfolding that would move us back to that state of heightened energy and feeling of perfection and oneness, and everything is perfect. And I'm wondering if, when we fall out of it, with the awareness of that possibility and that blueprint of that potentiality that was imprinted, can we be aware that everything is perfect now with what is, even though we fall back into a what is that we don't, quote, like. And when that happens, we again are in the field of like and dislike, judgment, value judgment of this is good, this is bad, which is choice, which is, apparent free will, but we still don't have free will, but we feel like we do. I'm feeling like we have free will when we're free of the field of conditioning, of the field of linear time. Then we're not bound by anything. We're free, and there's no will required to be free. It's just what is. It's a fact. So we use the feeling and sense of free will, which isn't true freedom, to create our way back to that state of so-called high energy, high consciousness. And as we do that, it seems that one but somehow, even though one goes back into this feeling of free will, one must humbly understand that there is no free will. And any action of will strengthens the I, which then at some point creates, when the energy comes in, it creates a very strong I of, I feel so good, and I hope this lasts forever in time, which can't be so, because change is constant. And when we don't accept that, we think in terms of good and bad. So we come back to go on a path of healing, and as we heal others. So, say for example, I was able to heal myself to the point where I no longer have to participate in psychiatry or the mental health system. I would then also heal others of the need to try to heal me in ways that don't help me. So I would be self-sufficient. And there'd be, if I don't do that, I'll be in and out of the hospital, in and out of services, and I'll be interacting with these people who have paid money to be trained in a certain way of steering me, which isn't freedom. But if I'm able to heal that, then I change all future possibilities. I'm no longer in that field of conditioning. I'm no longer interacting with those beings who have been trained. I heal them from the need to learn how to heal my broken self. Because I've healed myself through my own understanding, which I can only build by learning every single moment, not accepting a system of thought and stopping learning. We can only learn our way through this, through every moment of life, as life. The brain is designed to learn, and when we memorize something or accept something or believe something and put that in the brain below our awareness and operate that way, we're superimposing a pattern of life according to what others have told us that we haven't seen for ourselves. We only believe, which is conditioning. And the more we're conditioned, the more we can't see for ourselves. And seeing for ourselves is freedom. The book gave an interesting tidbit, which is that melatonin levels are highest between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. And he's also talking about how the pineal gland is what converts melatonin into other biochemicals that produce some of these mystical states. And I was thinking about that in terms of how oftentimes people who are labeled bipolar can't sleep. And that could be because it's not really odd for someone to stay up until 1 in the morning. And then if at 1 in the morning, the body and the pineal gland is converting melatonin into mystical biochemicals, one isn't going to be sleeping via the melatonin, one is going to be awake in a mystical state, or having mystical elements come into consciousness. And then if one is out and about in the world, like awake at 1 in the morning, wandering around, and that mystical stuff is mixed in, because one is awake because melatonin is being converted to mystical chemicals, then hence, I remember when I was first in that state for a whole month in 2011, I couldn't sleep until 4 or later, and maybe that's when the melatonin went away because it was finished converting into the mystical chemicals. So I was able to kind of sleep. I was only sleeping like 2 hours a night. And it could be possible that one doesn't need as much sleep when one is in a mystical consciousness, because sleep is partly to compensate for the conditioned structure of society that we've created that is totally against all the laws and neurophysiology of how we're designed. We're not designed to work like we work in human structures and information overload that we've created. So anyways, that is a very interesting tidbit about the melatonin. And also, when I got back from California last time and I had that weird waking up in the night experience that was short-lived and it was kind of scary, it was probably at like 1:30 in the morning. And when I had the crazy crisis experience in mid-October of last year and I was unable to sleep, that happened near 3:30 or 4 in the morning when I had that kind of suicide in my brain thing happen. So I don't think it's only mystical elements, but it's elements of past to being present now, which it is already present now. I think fluff keeps landing in my eyes. It's a lot of fluff. And he talks about a story of a woman who, her husband dies, and then it was in 2011, February 2011. That's when I was in California having synchronicity like you wouldn't believe. And then came back here into the conditioned structures and was diagnosed as nuts several months later. I think I was mainly nuts for coming back out of paradise. And now she's like a trainer for Dr. Joe Dispenza 6 years later, and I'm thinking to myself, it's been 7 years since I was labeled. I really hope this next 10 months is kind of transformative in some way. Transforming into that which has been imprinted and blueprinted, and all the possibilities that I've seen are possible. And I think that's why the next step for me is removing myself from people that see in terms of conditioning and things are impossible. And I'm just wondering what happens when one radically shifts into possibility while away from those and then comes back. Well, I should know, because that's what happened when I went to California 7 years ago. I went into possibility, but I didn't know it. And then I came back into conditioning, and that messed me up. So now when I go into possibility, I might think, well, I can go back, and maybe I can't. Maybe I can, I don't know. Maybe if I go into possibility for so long and come back, it manifests as having some kind of major relapse where I need major psychiatric care. I can see that as a possibility. Because I literally won't be able to communicate with that anymore unless I learn how to communicate with that. But I feel like I can learn how to communicate with that with people that don't have an attachment to me being who they think I am. But the ones that want me to be who they think I am, they wouldn't listen to me possibly in the same way. I remember before I was carted off to the hospital, I was saying to people around me, I was saying, I need to be somewhere quiet, and are you going to listen to me? Because I wanted to say what reality was like in that state, but they didn't want to listen. And then I got thrown in the psych ward. So it's okay if people don't want to listen, but it's not okay for me to think that I need to communicate with those who don't want to listen, because if they're not listening openly, they're projecting images of who they think I am onto me, and that warps space-time. It doesn't really warp me, it warps space-time. I'm in this realm of possibility, and I'm getting my wave function collapsed into the old limited personality. So that's my question. Can one root in possibility and still be able to have respectful communication with limitation? And can one test that, and can one come to a conclusion of, no, I can't, and say respectfully, I can't speak with you right now? Or does reality and existence intervene to disconnect physical manifestations? I see that as entirely possible. I remember that was one of the things that kind of scared me in that state of possibility, was I saw that if I went on with possibility, I would lose communication with certain others because our physical manifestations would no longer exist in the same physical reality as a gesture or manifestation of literally not being able to communicate. But it is possible that with technology, one can communicate through technology at a distance. So literally be in another world, but send an email or have a phone call and not coexist in physical space and time anymore. And people will kind of forget about the me that they think that I am. And I see how that manifests as someone getting Alzheimer's, you know? Like, if one day I come back and one that I come back to see doesn't even know who I am, that would actually be pretty accurate because they don't know who I am. And that's okay. So instead of me staying and taking on shit and manifesting as mentally ill, withdrawing energy, moving away, and allowing the illness to go where it wanted to or could go when I go somewhere else because I know the truth about myself. This all sounds very like grandiose. I don't know. I don't even know if it's true. I don't know what's true. Like I said, I'm experimenting with not wasting energy. And the wasting of energy is being around the conditioning, and that feeds the conditioning. It literally, like that good energy that would make flowers bloom that don't even exist yet, in connection with nature and the earth and Gaia, is feeding the structures of conditioning, and it actually increases the longevity of those who would wish to spend more time with us, who connect with that energy. And if we connected it and grounded in that energy and embodied it, we would leave. So when we're unable to leave, we get stuck. But that energy's still there, and it's feeding the longevity of the one who is mentally ill, feeding those around them so they can continue doing exactly what they're doing, which is what needs to be undone if they would listen to those who connect with the energy and are able to communicate it. But unfortunately, we don't know how, and then we communicate that we are these mentally ill people, and nothing changes. And longevity, that energy goes into the longevity of the structures of society that would oppress us, as well as the system of the family that would oppress us as well. And it increases their longevity. And then another possibility is, like I said, going away. Somebody gets Alzheimer's, somebody has this, somebody has that, and they don't realize it's because the one who they thought was so ill actually has access to an energy that, if could be communicated, could help all of us. It's infinite. But instead it acts as a battery to augment the limited, the conditioning. It's